Hi, my name is Jason Sabo, and I am proud to be meeting with all of you today from here in Austin, Texas, where I'm the founder and CEO of a consulting company called Frontera Strategy. We do advocacy at the Texas legislature and other places around the country and support philanthropists, foundations, and nonprofits as they do advocacy work in mostly state legislatures. Very excited to be joined today by all of you at this important event. And at the outset, I want to thank Exponent Philanthropy and the Michigan Council of Foundations for their sponsorship of this important event. And we'll be hearing from some of our partners from Michigan here in a minute. But we want to start off today's conversation, which is specifically targeted at advocacy, but more specifically targeted at how you as foundation professionals and you as family members can get your foundation's board of directors more engaged in advocacy, understanding that successful advocacy really does start at the top. And if you have buy-in from your board, you're much more likely to have an effective advocacy program, and you're much more likely to achieve the results that you want in the policy change atmosphere. If you have that kind of obvious buy-in and strong committed buy-in from your leadership. So today we're going to be talking about board and staff working together to find that advocacy voice at your foundations. So let's get into it. So when we think about advocacy, we tend to think about, lobbyists and going down to a state legislature or going to a city council or county commission or Congress and asking policymakers to change some policy for you. And that is advocacy, it is lobbying, but there's all different kinds of advocacy that foundations are involved in. There's self-interest advocacy, which is, when you're looking out for yourselves. And that doesn't even count as lobbying in most contexts because you're doing something that is protecting the rights of foundations and philanthropy. It's self-interested, and that's okay in this context. There's also issue-based advocacy done directly by the foundation itself. And this might not be something that your foundation has ever even thought about doing before, but it's not just about making grants. It's also about engaging the foundation itself, your board, your staff, all of your allies and your partners to become advocates as well. That's often the single best thing your foundation can do. And most importantly, and most often, it doesn't really cost much of anything, if anything at all. Also, when we think about advocacy, we have to think about issue-based advocacy through direct service organizations, through the programmatic work that you all are doing. Many people think that if you're going to be funding advocacy, it's an either or between advocacy or the programmatic work that you've traditionally funded. I would argue that the most effective philanthropists and the most effective nonprofit organizations receiving their money are those organizations and philanthropists who are doing it both, who are informing their advocacy work with programmatic work, and vice versa, informing their programmatic work with a deeper understanding of the larger systems in which they're operating. And the fourth and final kind of advocacy is funding traditional advocacy organizations like we already see in many contexts in many state legislatures and state capitals, and even in cities and counties and your county commissioners. There are advocacy organizations that have staffed professionals who are 501c3 organizations who are legally allowed to do all this kind of advocacy work, who can do this and kind of engage with and for you ultimately as your grantees. So let's move forward. Now, when you think about your role in all of this and who you are, I want everybody to understand that there's no right way to do this. There's no wrong way to do this. There's only your way to do this. And when we think about how your foundation is going to engage in advocacy, it can be however you want it to be. There's no model that says if you do it this way, you're doing it right, or if you do it this way, you're doing it wrong. Again, there's only your way. So for example, if you look at this continuum here, on the one side, some foundations that only want to fund the research. That's all, and that's all as aggressive as they want to be. And that's great because we need good research. And there are other foundations that might want to make a grant to an advocacy organization. They take that research and make sure that it doesn't sit, on a website, but actually is seen and used by policymakers. Then there are other foundations, this is the ones who may be a little bit the most aggressive, where the foundation trustees themselves become advocates and become engaged in the policymaking context. All of these strategies are effective, But the most effective foundations are the ones who are doing all three, not necessarily in-house, often in collaboration. But I urge you to think of where you are on this continuum and not think of yourself as not doing enough or not doing too much, but think of yourselves as doing exactly what you should be doing. And in part of all of this, you will listen, you will learn, and you will become more closely connected and in tune with how policymakers are thinking and the decisions and the realities that their ultimate choices make and frame for the world in which you're doing your work. Okay, next slide, please. Now, I would urge you to remember one thing. I work with a lot of foundations, some of them very, very, very big, some of them very, very, very small. I would urge you to remember that the smaller foundations are more nimble. They're more able to be a natural partner with people in their communities, legislators. They have this kind of common language of people coming to them, asking for assistance, and then having to figure out how to ration ultimately some of that assistance. You can be the person who connects these policymakers with the real world. You can bring them the research, the innovation, because let's be honest, you have the local awareness, the local knowledge that policymakers desperately need to do their jobs well. Okay, next slide. We're almost done with this before we open up our conversation. Now, earlier this year, Exponent Philanthropy, and in partnership with our firm Frontera Strategy, released a field guide for how foundations can safely and effectively do advocacy. It's available on the Exponent website. There's the plug. Now, I urge all of you to think this through and look at that, but just understand first and foremost, this is not rocket science. And there are 7 simple steps that your foundation can take, which are laid out in the field guide, that will help you become effective advocates. Number 1, focus. You can't do everything. Do what you do best. Do what you do with the most passion. Secondly, understand the context. Become knowledgeable about the issue and how it's playing out in your community. And participate in the process. Don't be sitting on the sidelines as your state legislature or city council or county commissioners make decisions. Be a part of the conversation. They'll welcome your input because they need good data that you can provide. And they also need to hear from all sides of the community, and that's something that you can help make possible. And you can also make sure that the media is aware of these conversations. And finally, you can make sure that you're working with government entities who are ultimately responsible for implementing whatever policy choices your policymakers might be making. Now, next slide, please. Now, urge all of you to remember that foundations, particularly small staff foundations, are uniquely positioned to do this kind of work. You have the relationships, you have the knowledge, you have the background, and you have the information necessary. And most importantly, you can move quickly. And I think that we see this often in moments of crisis where there'd be a natural disaster or some kind of other horrible situation in the community. And instantly, almost overnight or even overnight, philanthropists will come together to do amazing things. We have the capacity to be nimble and flexible. And I believe that in this moment of politics and division and divisiveness, now more than ever, we need foundations to come in and be those community leaders, to join people together to create a place for that larger conversation. Now, we're fortunate today that we're joined by some folks, next slide please, who have the capacity to kind of talk through all of this. And we have the capacity to really think with some of our foundation partners about the work that they're doing. And we're joined today by 3 foundation professionals who are working, 2 of them in Michigan, 1 in Maryland, doing interesting work, some from a family foundation perspective, but also from a community foundation perspective. Some foundations who are farther along in this advocacy journey, and others who are just beginning these conversations with their boards of directors. And what we're going to do first is allow these folks to introduce themselves briefly, and then I'm going to throw out some questions based upon conversations we've already had in prep for today's conversation. But then we're going to kind of jump off a little bit based upon what we're hearing and what I know these folks are up to in their own contexts. So let's start off, and if Carrie, you could go first, and then Jennifer, and then Mike, if you could introduce yourself last, please.
Great. Hi, everyone. I'm Carrie McHugh, Program Officer for the Helen J. Sereni Foundation. We are a small family foundation based in Maryland. It is named after my grandmother, so despite the fact that I have a different last name, I am a family to the family of the Family Foundation. And we work specifically around root causes and systems change for poverty alleviation locally in the state of Maryland. And I will talk a little bit more about how that led us into an advocacy path as we continue this discussion, but I'm really excited to be here.
Hi, Jennifer Poteet with the Harry A. and Margaret D. Towsley Foundation, which is based in Ann Arbor, but does, that's Ann Arbor, Michigan, sorry, I should clarify, because they got it wrong on Jeopardy the other night. We do granting throughout the state of Michigan. Mike?
I think Mike may have had a frozen up on us. He'll be back with us in a second, I think. So I'm going to start off, if I could, throw a question out there to you all about the early conversations that you had with your board of directors about all of this. When you if you think back when you're first starting, most organizations who might be watching today are many of them are just starting these conversations with the board. What specific strategies did you use to get the ball rolling? How did you broach this? What did you do to get the conversation started? Go ahead, Jennifer.
Yeah, okay. Well, I was going to say that we're still sort of getting started. I have, for almost 20 years, participated in Foundations on the Hill with the Council on Michigan Foundations. And I find it incredibly educational. I find it very interesting to discover both the level of understanding and the lack of understanding of our sector by our lawmakers and policymakers. Mm-hmm. And I feel that this is the thing, I don't think of so much of it as advocacy as education, and sharing with them the things that we're doing and the differences that we're making. And really getting buy-in from them as to what we do and why we need to be able to continue to do it unhindered.
So how about you, Carrie? How did you get this conversation started with your board?
It's a really good question, because frankly, we didn't get this conversation started in the way that we probably should have in hindsight, right? So we were not explicit about the fact that we wanted to move into funding advocacy, working in the advocacy space. So we had a mission that stated that we focused on root causes and systems change, but we never really took a deeper dive and got really clear about naming that systems change component might include advocacy, until we had a grant application come in from something that would fall into number 4 of those buckets. Sorry about that. Which was an advocacy organization, right? So a nonprofit that only funds or only does advocacy and research work, which led to a really interesting conversation at the board level about some concerns that wasn't a space we wanted to be in, that wasn't work we had said we were going to do explicitly. So we had to pause on that grant application and move backwards to start to talk about, some of the myths around advocacy, to your point, Jennifer, right? So that it is okay for foundations and nonprofits to engage in advocacy and policy work, and then also start to pick apart like what the board's interests were, what kind of advocacy work they were willing to engage in, interested in engaging in, and what that was going to look like moving forward. And Mike, you're back, so I'm going to stop so you can introduce yourself.
Yeah, Mike, if you could introduce yourself and then talk to us a little bit about how you began this conversation with your board. And something that I've heard you say earlier that I thought was really interesting, that would be instructive here. If you could also talk to us a little bit about language and how important words are in these conversations.
Yeah, no, happy to. Sorry for the drop there. I believe I'm adding broadband access to my list of things that we're going to advocate for here at the Community Foundation. But no, Mike Gorehouse with the Holland Zealand Community Foundation. We're in the southwest corner of Michigan. We're a community foundation like many community foundations that isn't issue specific, but are very focused on our local community in a wide variety of ways. So specific to advocacy, Jason, I really appreciate your slide where you outlined kind of 4 different ways that foundations can engage in advocacy. I think you said self-interest, issue-based advocacy ourselves, issue-based by funding direct service organizations, and then funding advocacy organizations. I would consider us to be an organization that participates in the first 3 of those 4. But as you alluded to, language does matter. I want to stand in solidarity with those that are watching this panel. If your board is scared of the word advocacy, I'm on your team. And I'll tell you just a brief little story. I literally had a board member 2 years ago send me an email after I had showed up and participated in a conversation at a county commission meeting, where the following day the email said, in not so nice terms, Mike, you do understand that you crossed the line from leadership into advocacy. If this is going to be an advocacy organization, inherently that means we can't be a leadership organization. So we had an interesting conversation, that person's perspective, about what the difference was between leadership and advocacy, and that led to a lot of things. But I share that story to say that depending on where you are, the word advocacy alone might be very scary to your organization, staff, and board, because advocacy tends to mean legislation. Legislation tends to mean politics, and politics tends to be very scary for people, particularly in a community that is very divided around politics. If you're a very homogeneous community or organization in their political nature, then maybe politics isn't as scary. But if you're divided amongst different lines, then the idea of politics and legislation are very scary. So I do think, as a foundation looking to get into this work, I think you can get into all kinds of advocacy work without even, by choosing the right language, because what matters is the work that you're doing, right? I think we could talk more about that, but the work of elevating the gaps in policy that are leading to many of the things that we have to fund is at the core of what I think advocacy work can be. And you can talk about those things without even using some of the language that may set off your board.
You know, you're using the word scare, scary, afraid. Carrie, I know this is something you've dealt with too. And I mean, when we think about how you have to have these conversations with your boards, you've heard a lot of different fears. You just alluded to this a minute ago. What are some of the fears that people might not be expecting to hear from their boards that you've encountered?
So for us, so just for context setting, we were founded in 2012 and started grant making in 2013. So as far as foundations go, we're one of the very new kids on the block. And in a lot of ways that works in our favor, right? So it means that I have board members who came in who don't have a long legacy of foundations aren't allowed to do advocacy, foundations aren't allowed to talk to regulators, foundations aren't allowed to talk to legislators, like, right? So we didn't have those kinds of fears. What came up as we started to see some grant applications specifically around advocacy work, and these are organizations that are doing research on state policy, right? But they do, to your point, Mike, language really matters. They have the word policy in their name. They have the word advocacy in their mission, right? So they're not partisan. They're not doing campaigning. They're not supporting a particular politician. And yet they are very much working in that legislative arena. And the fears that started to come up were really interesting and required us to actually walk back and have a more values-based conversation. So we had some board members who were like, oh, well, this is really interesting, but what if they start advocating for something that we don't like? Which required us to pause and stop and think about what that means. What does it mean we don't like it? Who are we to decide what we like and what we don't like, right? We are a wealthy white family funding in communities we're trying to dismantle systems of poverty. We don't live inside of those systems of poverty. If anything, we benefit from those systems of poverty. So who are we to determine what we don't like and whether or not that's good for the community? So we had to take a step back and just think about what it means to be in relationship with our grant partners, what it means for those grant partners to be in relationship with the communities they aim to serve, where there are feedback loops, where there are opportunities for education and for listening, and to sort of pick apart whether or not we're talking about trusting organizations and communities to come up with solutions, or whether we want to hold all of the power and all of the control, which frankly has nothing to do with advocacy. It has everything to do with how you approach grant making in general, but it really bubbled up in this advocacy space and required us to have some really vulnerable conversations. But once we did, we moved into a really great place where now that's a core part of what our grant portfolio looks like.
So when it's almost like, Carrie, you're like giving us a little peek into the boardroom, right? So Jennifer, if we could have a peek into your boardroom as much as you feel comfortable sharing, I mean, how does this work out with your board? I mean, are there generational issues? How does this all, for the context that you're dealing with, which is different than a community foundation?
It's very different, but we have board members who are interested in the arts. We have board members who are interested in social services. We have board members who are, live in different parts of the state. I have two cousins who are on the board who live in Southern California. So the viewpoints are very different. One is he's a writer, one of the cousins in California, and the other one is a professional photographer. So they come to things very differently, but they also have witnessed a lot of the injustices that have happened to the homeless people in San Diego, which just makes them furious. And they found some very unique ways. You were talking about smaller foundations being powerful in ways to really invest themselves personally with local policymakers and legislators. And I find that is very much the case, when I go and I say, okay, where, which public elementary school needs the most help? And, and somebody can tell me that, and why. Is it endemic in the community where that school is? Is it a leadership problem? And I really enjoy that part. I would tell you that our board meetings, we've sort of have a division of labor, so that I am part of the grants committee, which is a smaller committee of the full board, and we go through the grants and then we give our recommendations to the full board. And, sometimes they don't agree with us at all, which is fine. But it can be an onerous job. At first, it was only the chair of the board who was going through all the grants, and that didn't work either. So, because it was way too much work for one person. And we are all volunteer, so get that. And we also have one administrative person who is part-time. I mean, she's not even half-time. She's Monday through Thursday from 9 to 12. So we're pretty organizing and running. And we do have a few outside trustees. And I would say that for the most part, it's interesting because in any one of the trustees' sort of field of expertise, whether it's geographic or theme-oriented, type of grant-oriented, whether it's education or arts or environment, that there seems to be a lot of respect of the different other board members to listen to that person discuss their area of expertise, which is helpful. As far as advocacy goes, we don't use that word. We just know that there are issues that need to be addressed. That's sort of how we do it, because I have certain older relatives, if you mention the word advocacy, they say, well, we're not allowed to do that. It's exactly what you were talking about, Carrie. And we were founded in the 1950s by my grandparents. So we have been around a bit longer and dealt with some more vagaries of changes in attitudes towards foundations. And, but I completely agree with you, who are we to tell people in need the best way to solve their problems? We are actually always very impressed with the creative nature of problem solving that many of the foundations that come to us represent. Our foundations, many of the potential grantees, the applicants who come to us address. So I've said enough. Pick up.
Can I build on something Jennifer said? Jennifer, you mentioned earlier an example about education funding and which schools need the most support. So I'll give you an example of how we early got into this game, Jason, is how you frame why you're doing a grant the way you're doing it is your choice, right? And I think there's an opportunity for all foundations, while we talk about grants, even if they're programmatic, even if they are advocacy in nature, you can share the policy reasons why that grant is needed as an entree for people into this advocacy work. So by example, in Michigan, per pupil funding is not the same district over district. There's different per pupil funding by different educational districts. Well, sharing that reality from a policy perspective as to why said school is going to need additional support educates people. during COVID, early on, we did direct cash assistance to undocumented immigrants and mixed status families in our community. And I could have said they're the highest need in our community right now. Instead, what I also said was they're in the highest need because all these federal stimulus packages have left out mixed status families and undocumented immigrants as recipients. That's why we need to fund them. You see the slight shift there? It was still a programmatic grant, but we framed it at what is the policy context that led to the need for the program grant. That grant wasn't all of a sudden an advocacy grant, but you used that moment to educate board members, staff, and community, and donors in my case, about realities of policy as an entree to what eventually needs to be like. Now let's talk about changing policies. But even before you get to that step, you can just frame some of your work around the current legislative environment that leads to the needs.
Mike, I love that framing, that opportunity for, right? I don't want to say it's a teachable moment. It's a learning moment. It's a shifting moment. It's a way to take a reality that not everybody is aware of and raise that awareness. And if there's not an appetite for advocacy in the explicit terms, acknowledging where our systems are flawed and failing and where our missions align with correcting or filling the gaps within those systems. I mean, frankly, that is advocacy, right? We all know that. And yet,
but I have a question, Carrie, a follow-up question about that. Yeah. As I'm listening, you guys have all used the word, I think all of you, the word systems change, you're changing systems. In many ways, historically, most foundations, presumably yours included, have really focused on the immediate programmatic needs, the Band-Aid, for lack of a better way of thinking of it, right? Talk to us about the conversation that you've had internally about blending your Band-Aid supply, your programmatic work, with this emerging interest in advocacy. Do people feel like advocacy is going to take away from the programmatic work, distract from it, hamper it in some way? How have you dealt with that internally in your board conversations, that balance?
So, and Jason, I don't know if this question was for me specifically, but if it was, I'm going to call it a leading question because you were there for some of these conversations. So Jason, I actually had Jason, was that 6 years ago, Jason? Jason came and spoke to our board about advocacy. So you were there for parts of these conversations, but the way we did it is we sort of, within those buckets of different kinds of advocacy and what advocacy could look like, what we tried to do as we sort of started this conversation, like I said, we had to move backwards before we could move forwards. So in moving backwards, we actually lifted up the grant partners that we already had and the grants that we had already made that were doing this work around systems change that wouldn't have traditionally fallen into the, what some of our more cautious or risk averse, if I can use that term, although I use the term risk in philanthropy very loosely because what is the risk, right? I think that's something that all funders, especially boards, need to sit with. What exactly are we risking? But anyway, my risk averse board members were sort of hesitant around this concept of advocacy. Mike and Jennifer, right to your points, right? Like, well, we don't want to get into partisan things. We don't want to get political. So what we did is we lifted up, we had several organizations that I was going to say were, but we actually still fund them, are direct service organizations that use what they learn from their clients in the process of delivering those direct services to keep their legislators informed about how different, forget legislation, right? Because legislation gets into lobbying, which can be its own bucket of things, but just how regulations, so how legislation is translated into reality, right? Which actually has nothing to do with legislation. It has everything to do with regulation. It is not ever considered lobbying. Jason, I'm going to let you talk about that detail because that's way out of my wheelhouse. But we had several grant partners who were doing that, right? Before I hopped on this call, I looked up just for my own context. Jennifer, I think you were talking about the need to educate our representatives and the systems that we all operate within. And there I go with systems again. In the state of Maryland, and I know that not everybody listening is in Maryland, but just for context, we're a fairly small state. The Maryland General Assembly, which was in session from January to April of 2021, heard 2,347 bills of which approximately 800 were passed. So if you are a representative from a local jurisdiction in Maryland, what is the likelihood that you're an expert on all 2,347 pieces of legislation you're asked to consider? You can't, no one is that good at everything like that. It's impossible. So if there are opportunities for those who actually have that experience to step in and say, this isn't malicious, but you're just not thinking through the ramifications of how this is going to land once it's actually enacted. I think that's incredibly huge. And Mike, that goes to what you were talking about with that example of, right? So we need to fund these kinds of grants because of the impact of these systems, right? So it's the flip side of that, but they work hand in hand. And you can tell that despite my Irish name, I'm very Italian because I keep speaking with my hands.
You know, Jason,
Jennifer or Mike, any comments on this?
well, I'll just give two examples of where we did, I think, what Carrie's kind of talking about into the nature of your question of how do you move from program to policy. Some are easier issues than others. I want to acknowledge that. So I'll just give you two quick ones. In the housing world, we were getting after affordable housing, and this is no judgment on the Habitat for Humanity model, but the Habitat for Humanity model, at least in our community, you got to raise about $180,000 of philanthropic support to build a house. And that's one house, right? And so you can pretty easily point to the local municipality zoning laws that are leading to higher costs of housing. And with reasonable changes to the zoning laws, you can let the market system spin through hundreds, if not thousands of new units for a cost, a fraction of the cost to what a philanthropic program investment into one Habitat house is. I'm not saying we don't need both. I'm just saying you can show math, numbers, not even philosophical, how you could generate many, many more affordable housing units in the policy side change, zoning law change, than in the program side. I'll give you one more example, and that is we have funded a migrant mentoring program for a long time. Now, let's think about this. So the goal of the migrant mentoring program is to support young people and migrant families to help them thrive throughout their lives. Well, it's also easy to point out that one of the reasons we have to have a migrant mentoring program and support migrant young people in their educational pursuits is because 3 months of the year, in the middle 3 months, they don't get to go to our local school. They go to our local school for 4 months, then we don't allow them to live in our community because they're a migrant, so they have to move somewhere else, and then they come back for the back 3 years. So it was a perfect ability to share with the board. We could fund program after program after program for migrant young people, but as long as they're not allowed to live in our community for the middle 3 months of school, I don't care who you are, if you miss the middle 3 months of school, you're gonna need extra supports to be successful in education. So those are two examples of kind of logical things that people fund program-wise, that when you talk about the policy behind it, if you don't address the policy, either in the housing example, you're probably choosing a more inefficient use of resources to solve your goal of affordable housing. Or in the case of the migrant example, you're actually spending resources that you have to continue to spend forever and ever and ever until you fix the fact that they can't be here for 3 months in the middle. It's just two examples of how you can have the conversation in the context of program funding, but also then shift to some of the policy work.
Jennifer, do you have any comments here?
Yeah, we don't, as a family foundation, we don't get that deeply involved with that type of conversation, but we are very aware there are things that we don't use political terms like policy or advocacy or anything like that because of who's on the board. So but I know, things that are grants that we like to see, things for marginalized communities where there's not a lot of other foundation activity, particularly rural Michigan, around healthcare and things like that. And so I think that is a bit what Mike is talking about is, you can address the issue, but you also have to address the policy. And simple things like buying vans for visiting nurses. Because how are they supposed to get there to see these people in rural areas where they're very sparsely populated? And it's just, I think that's the type of thing that we like to see is, and also, as I said, the creative problem solving. I'm sorry, I don't really have a really specific response to Mike and Carrie, because being a family foundation, we're a little more organic and a little less hierarchically set up. So there's a little more give and take and conversation. And we are also somewhat dependent, which I would like to change at some point. We are more dependent on what grants come to us rather than which things we go out to choose and work on. So that's another issue.
So it sounds to me like we're hearing this kind of, to summarize what I'm hearing from everybody. So, Carrie, you're talking about essentially, really thinking about your own value set, your own value system before you begin these conversations, to internalize it, think about who you are, what your values are, and then instead of blowing things up and starting anew, go to your existing grantees who you already are a reflection of your values through your programmatic work, and lift them and elevate them into the conversation. Is that fair characterization?
Mm-hmm.
And Mike, I'm hearing you is to really explore with your board the policies behind the things that you care about. So not necessarily leading with the policies, but leading with the programmatic work, to use your word, framed within the context of the policies that created the need that you're addressing in the first place. Is that also a fair characterization? And finally, Jennifer, what I'm hearing is that you're opening the door, literally, for your trustees to visit with people, to really kind of begin that conversation more directly. So all incredibly effective strategies, but sounds very different based upon your unique board contexts, political contexts, and the issue set that you're choosing to address, which I think is kind of, probably Exponent Philanthropy's point in bringing all of us together here with, Michigan Council of Foundations, is to demonstrate that every foundation is coming at this. If you've met one foundation, you've met one foundation. If you've met one foundation board, maybe you've met one foundation's board. There's probably some other side conversation happening as well. So, so just knowing that, it's just really, thank you all so much for kind of rounding things out and providing that broader perspective.
And thank you, Jason, for facilitating.
So do any of you have any kind of parting thoughts of wisdom in the 30 seconds, because we do need to wrap this up for time's sake?
I don't like you said
thoughts from each of you. Mike, you go first.
Well, I didn't like you said wisdom. I don't know if it's wisdom, but I will say to those that are watching, there are, even when you get to the tactical side beyond the entry points into advocacy, we have found there are definitely multiple ways to work, right? So you can be public, right? We're showing up to public council meetings and county commission meetings, whatever else. You can also do a lot of advocacy work behind the scenes. You have relationships with your local county administrator, your city manager, or superintendent of public schools, or whatever it may be. And you may not think of that as advocacy work, but when you're sitting down for lunch or in that group meeting and there's a conversation around community needs or what needs to happen, you have a voice and you have influence because you're there representing a foundation. So I would just encourage folks that you have an obligation, maybe, or an opportunity is a better word, to use your voice to influence things in that way too. And so use your connections and your relationships with people who are influential to help them think through these issues, because that's a different way to get advocacy involved, marching on the streets with signs. So
Carrie, any parting wisdom for folks?
Yeah, I would just piggyback on top of what Mike said and encourage folks to think about the fact that being in a foundation, associated with a foundation, whether you're a trustee or staff, comes with a certain amount of reputational power. And philanthropy at the end of the day is about money, and the money that private philanthropy can offer to large scale system-wide solutions is quite literally a drop in the bucket compared to municipal, county, state, and or federal budgets. And that's not even including the 5% payout rate, right? That's just thinking about endowments. It is a drop in the bucket. And so what can we do? How can we complement the financial resources that philanthropy brings into community with relational resources, with extra power, right? We can talk about power dynamics. They exist. at some point we can just lean into that fact and use them to advantage the community at the end of the day, like Mike is talking about. And that, to me, it goes hand in hand with grant making. And if you're thinking about one, it's perfectly logical to think about the other. But there needs to be a nuance to it to get over some people's concerns.
The power goes beyond the money. There's
Yes.
more to a foundation than a checkbook. Last parting words for us, Jennifer?
I'm just, I feel like I sit in a very different place than the other panelists because of how our foundation functions. But I really have learned so much from your conversation. And I also would like to say that, you know, I'm a great fan of Foundations on the Hill, and CMF is starting this year. Hopefully we're going to start this year, Foundations in Lansing. So we're going to just try to not get to know every single one of the state legislators, but, you know, we've picked out, sort of cherry picked several that we really want to get to know, and we want them to get to know us so that we can have these ongoing conversations with lawmakers and not have to, you know, try and break the ice every time we speak to them. And so I also would say that I did 9 years on the Ann Arbor Area Community Foundation Board, and it was a very different experience than being on the Family Foundation Board. And it really was. I learned, that's the other thing I'll say about being on a community foundation board, is you learn so much in depth about your own community and what effect you can have. And I think that it does follow the money, but it's also, people start to ask you questions about what can they do to help, you know, resolve problems. And it allows you to just say, hey, don't just ask me, but ask all these other people too. And I think it's really valuable work, and it's really educational work. And I think that anybody who wants to get involved in their community should just go look.
Terrific. That's the perfect way to end today's conversation. I want to thank each of you, Carrie, Mike, Jennifer, for your participation today. Again, thank you, Madeline, for bringing us together. And of course, thank our hosts and sponsors,